2005 as a young cop. I was dispatched to reports of a man down in the street, part of the city that was crime-ridden and dangerous. I found a victim, teenager, and I held the mortal wound in the back of his head, whispered prayer into his ear as his life flowed from his body. He died there in my arms on the street. He was killed by an axe handle. I am prayerful for America. I'm prayerful for healing, and I'm prayerful for discernment amongst this body and my colleagues. As a law enforcement officer, I know what it means to swear an oath to protect and serve my community and my nation, and the importance of bringing justice to the families of those who suffer at the hands of evil. And it is essential that the fundamental freedoms, First Amendment, Second Amendment, Fourth Amendment, are always protected and preserved by this body. I was sworn as a man, I swore an oath to uphold the Constitution of the United States, and I will never back down from defending that Constitution, including the rights of law-abiding Americans to keep and bear arms. Madam Chair, I thank you for this hearing today, and I yield.
The gentleman yields. Now we will introduce our witnesses. I'd like to turn it over to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Higgins, to introduce our first witness. Without objection, Mr. Higgins is authorized to participate in today's hearing. He represents Buffalo, and you are now recognized, Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member, the honorable members of the Oversight and Reform Committee. The Greek tragic poet Aeschylus says that we suffer our way to wisdom. He says we suffer our way to wisdom. To live is to suffer, to endure the suffering is to give meaning to the suffering. We have a problem in this country. Unless we learn from the tragic events of the last 3 weeks, who are we as a people? And this brave group of panelists from 2 cities that were devastated, a destruction beyond human comprehension, we have to find a way to deal with this. In Buffalo, the shooting started at 2:30 in the afternoon and was concluded in 2 minutes and 3 seconds. One shooter, a semi-automatic weapon, 13 people shot, 10 dead, one shooter. If you look for a common denominator in all of these, it's typically someone that should never have had a gun with a high-capacity weapon to kill as many people as quickly as possible. Zanetta Everhart is here. She is a friend and a proud citizen of the city of Buffalo. Zanetta is with us today as the mother of a Buffalo mass shooting survivor, Zaire Goodman. Zaire was working at the Tops Friendly market that was targeted by a white supremacist, racist, deranged gunman. Zaire is also a colleague in government. She is the Director of Diversity and Inclusion for my friend and colleague, New York State Senator Tim Kennedy. Zanetta's story is both tragic and magic. And with that, it gives me great honor to present to the committee Zanetta Everhart.
Thank you. And after Ms. Everhart, we will hear from Dr. Roy Guerrero, who is a pediatrician in Uvalde, Texas. Then we will hear from Mia Cirillo, who is a 4th grader at Robb Elementary School in Texas. Mia will be sharing her experience in a pre-recorded video. Her father, Miguel, is with us in the room today and will be making brief remarks after his daughter's video. Then he will excuse himself. Next, we will hear from Felix and Kimberly Rubio, who are the parents of Lexi Rubio, who tragically lost her life in the Texas shooting. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, to introduce our last witness on this panel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's my honor to recognize Lucretia Hughes. She is part of my constituency, an incredibly bright light in our 10th district, and she has an extremely compelling story. I just wanted to publicly recognize Lucretia. I want to thank you for being here today. I know it's hard to share the story that you come to us with, but we are grateful that you're here. And I just, Madam Chair, I want to say thank you for just these few seconds to recognize Lucretia Hughes and welcome her here. I yield.
Thank you. The witnesses will be unmuted so we can swear them in. Please raise your right hands. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God.
I do.
Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Ms. Everhart, you are now recognized for your testimony. Please testify, Ms. Everhart.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Zaire, my son Goodman, my son, or as I like to call him, the kid, was shot and injured by a domestic terrorist on Saturday, May 14, 2022, at the Tops grocery store where he was an employee in a historically Black community on Jefferson Avenue in Buffalo, New York. Zaire, the kid, is now a 21-year-old man. He's pure joy. He's everything that is good in this world. And as I sit here before you today, I can hear my son telling me to stop being extra and get to the point. I was going to tell you all a bunch of fluffy stories about Zaire, but I have a message. So I'll get to the point. As Director of Diversity and Inclusion with New York State Senator Tim Kennedy's office, stories of gun violence and racism are all too familiar, but now these stories are Zaire stories. These problems literally knocked on my front door. These are issues that as a country we do not like to openly discuss. Domestic terrorism exists in this country for 3 reasons. America is inherently violent. This is who we are as a nation. The very existence of this country was founded on violence, hate, and racism, with the near annihilation of my Native brothers and sisters. My ancestors brought to America through the slave trade were the first currency of America. Let me say that again for the people in the back. My ancestors, the first currency of America, were stripped of their heritage and culture, separated from their families, bargained for on auction blocks, sold, beaten, raped, and lynched. Yet I continuously hear after every mass shooting that this is not who we are as Americans and as a nation. Hear me clearly. This is exactly who we are. Education. Majority of what I have learned about African American history, I did not learn until I went to college, and I had to choose those classes. Why is that? Why is African American history not a part of American history? African Americans built this country from the ground up. My ancestors' blood is embedded in the soil. We have to change the curriculum in schools across the country so that we may adequately educate our children. Reading about history is crucial to the future of this country. Learning about other cultures, ethnicities, and religions in schools should not be something that is up for debate. We cannot continue to whitewash education, creating generations of children to believe that one race of people are better than the other. Our differences should make us curious, not angry. At the end of the day, I bleed, you bleed. We are all human. That awful day that will now be a part of the history books, hopefully, let us not forget to add that horrific day to the curriculum that we teach our children. Guns. The 18-year-old terrorist who stormed into my community armed with an AR-15, killing 10 people and injuring 3 others, received a shotgun from his parents for his 16th birthday. For Zaire's 16th birthday, I bought him a few video games, some headphones, a pizza, and a cake. We are not the same. How and why? And what in the world is wrong with this country? Children should not be armed with weapons. Parents who provide their children with guns should be held accountable. Lawmakers who continuously allow these mass shootings to continue by not passing stricter gun laws should be voted out. To the lawmakers who feel that we do not need stricter gun laws, let me paint a picture for you. My son, Zaire, has a hole in the right side of his neck, 2 on his back, and another on his left leg, caused by an exploding bullet from an AR-15. As I clean his wounds, I can feel pieces of that bullet in his back. Shrapnel will be left inside of his body for the rest of his life. Now I want you to picture that exact scenario for one of your children. This should not be your story or mine. As an elected official, it is your duty to draft legislation that protects Zaire and all of the children and citizens in this country. Common sense gun laws are not about your personal feelings or beliefs. You are elected because you have been chosen and are trusted to protect us. But let me say to you here today, I do not feel protected. No citizen needs an AR-15. These weapons are designed to do the most harm in the least amount of time. And on Saturday, May 14th, it took a domestic terrorist just 2 minutes to shoot and kill 10 people and injure 3 others. If, after hearing from me and the other people testifying here today, does not move you to act on gun laws, I invite you to my home to help me clean Zaire's wounds so that you may see up close the damage that has been caused to my son and to my community. To the families of Ruth Whitfield, Pearl Young, Catherine Massey, Hayward Patterson, Celestine Cheney, Geraldine Talley, Aaron Salter, Andre McNeil, Marcus Morrison, and Roberta Drury, I promise that their deaths will not be in vain. Zaire and I promise to use our voice to lift their names, and we will carry their spirit with us as we embark on this journey to create change. I know that their collective souls watched out for Zaire that day, and I am eternally grateful to them for that. To the east side of Buffalo, I love you. I'm speaking directly to my people, to my hood. From Bailey to Broadway, to Kensington, to Fillmore, to Delavan, to Jefferson, and every street in between. Just like the potholes that we want filled in, yes, I keep it real, together we will continue to fill those streets with love, no matter what people say about the east side of Buffalo. We will not be broken. I was born there, raised there. I raised my son there, I still live there, and I do the majority of my professional work on the east side of Buffalo. I vow to you today that everywhere I go, I will make sure that the people hear the real stories of our people. For too long, our community has been neglected and starved of the resources that we so greatly need. I promise that I will not stop pushing for more resources to be funneled into the east side of Buffalo. Each and every person that lives within that community, we are family. Not a perfect community, but I know that we are love. To the greater Buffalo area, to everyone from around the country and the world who have reached out and loved on us. On behalf of Zaire, Zaire's father, Damian Goodman, my mother, my father, my sisters, my brothers, and myself, we thank you. We thank you for all of your thoughts and your prayers. Thank you for all of the love and support you have shown us during this difficult time. But I also say to you today, with a heart full, from the outpouring of love that you all so freely gave us, your thoughts and prayers are not enough. We need you to stand with us in the days, weeks, months, and years to come, and be ready to go to work and help us to create the change that this country so desperately needs. And I will end with a quote from Charles Bloom in his book, The Devil We Know. Race, as we have come to understand it, is a fiction, but racism, as we have come to live it, is a fact. The point here is not to impose a new racial hierarchy, but to remove an existing one. After centuries of waiting for white majorities to overturn white supremacy, it is to me that it has fallen to Black people to do it themselves, and I stand at the ready. Zaire, this is for you, kid. Happy birthday.
Thank you. Dr. Guerrero, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairwoman. My name is Dr. Roy Guerrero. I'm a board-certified pediatrician and was present at Uvalde Memorial Hospital the day of the massacre on May 24th, 2022 at Robb Elementary School. I was called here today as a witness, but I showed up because I am a doctor. Because how many years ago I swore an oath to do no harm. After witnessing firsthand the carnage in my hometown of Uvalde, to stay silent would have betrayed that oath. Inaction is harm. Passivity is harm. Delay is harm. So here I am, not to plead, not to beg or convince you of anything, but to do my job, and hope that by doing so, it inspires the members of this House to do theirs. I've lived in Uvalde my whole life. In fact, I attended Robb Elementary School myself as a kid. As often is the case with us grown-ups, we remember a lot of the good and not so much of the bad. So I don't recall homework or detention. I remember how much I loved going to school. What a joyful time it was. Back then, we were able to run between classrooms with ease to visit our friends. And I remember the way the cafeteria smelled at lunchtime on hamburger Thursdays. It was right around lunchtime on a Tuesday that the gunman entered the school through a main door without restriction, massacred 19 students and 2 teachers, and changed the way that every student at Robb and their families remember that school forever. I doubt they'll remember the smell of the cafeteria or the laughter ringing in the hallways. Instead, they'll be haunted by the memory of screams and bloodshed, panic and chaos, police shouting, parents wailing. I know I will never forget what I saw that day. For me, that day started like any typical Tuesday in our pediatric clinic. Moms calling for coughs, boogers, sports physicals, right before the summer rush. School was out in 2 days. Then summer camps would guarantee some grazes and ankle sprains, injuries that could be patched up and fixed with a Mickey Mouse sticker as a reward. Then at 12:30, business as usual stopped, and with it, my heart. A colleague from a San Antonio trauma center texted me and said, "Why are pediatric surgeons and anesthesiologists on call for a mass shooting in Uvalde?" I raced to the hospital to find parents outside yelling children's names in desperation and sobbing as they begged for any news related to their child. Those mothers' cries I will never get out of my head. As I entered the chaos of the ER, the first casualty I came across was Mia Cerrillo. She was sitting in the hallway. Her face was still clearly in shock, but her whole body was shaking from the adrenaline coursing through it. The white Lilo and Stitch shirt that she wore was covered in blood, and her shoulder was bleeding from a shrapnel injury. Sweet Mia, I've known her my whole life. As a baby, she survived major liver surgeries against all odds. And once again, she's here as a survivor, inspiring us with her story today and her bravery. When I saw Mia sitting there, I remembered having seen her parents outside. So after quickly examining 2 other patients of mine in the hallway with minor injuries, I raced outside to let them know that Mia was alive. I wasn't ready for their next urgent and desperate question. Where's Elena? Elena is Mia's 8-year-old sister, who was also at Robb at the time of the shooting. I had heard from some of the nurses that there were 2 dead children who had been moved to the surgical area of the hospital. As I made my way there, I prayed that I wouldn't find her. I didn't find Elena. But what I did find was something no prayer will ever relieve. 2 children whose bodies had been pulverized by bullets fired at them, decapitated, whose flesh had been ripped apart, that the only clue as their identities was a blood-splattered cartoon clothes still clinging to them, clinging for life and finding none. I could only hope these 2 bodies were a tragic exception to the list of survivors. But as I waited there with my fellow Uvalde doctors, nurses, first responders, and hospital staff for other casualties we hope to save, they never arrived. All that remained was the bodies of 17 more children and the 2 teachers who cared for them, who dedicated their careers to nurturing and respecting the awesome potential of every single one, just as we doctors do. I'll tell you why I became a pediatrician, because I knew that children were the best patients. They accept the situation as it's explained to them. You don't have to coax them into changing their lifestyles in order to get better or plead them to modify their behavior as you do with adults. No matter how hard you try to help an adult, their path to healing is always determined by how willing they are to take action. Adults are stubborn. We're resistant to change, even when the change will make things better for ourselves, but especially when we think we're immune to the fallout. Why else would there have been such little progress made in Congress to stop gun violence? Innocent children all over the country today are dead because laws and policy allows people to buy weapons before they're legally old enough to even buy a pack of beer. They're dead because restrictions have been allowed to lapse. They're dead because there are no rules about where guns are kept, because no one is paying attention to who is buying them. The thing I can't figure out is whether our politicians are failing us out of stubbornness, passivity, or both. I said before that as grown-ups, we have a convenient habit of remembering the good and forgetting the bad. Never more so than when it comes to our guns. Once the blood is rinsed away from the bodies of our loved ones and scrubbed off the floors of the schools and supermarkets and churches, the carnage from each scene is erased from our collective conscience, and we return again to nostalgia, to the rose-tinted view of our Second Amendment as a perfect instrument of American life, no matter how many lives are lost. I chose to be a pediatrician. I chose to take care of children. Keeping them safe from preventable diseases, I can do. Keeping them safe from bacteria and brittle bones, I can do. But making sure our children are safe from guns, that's the job of our politicians and leaders. In this case, you are the doctors, and our country is the patient. We are lying on the operating table, riddled with bullets like the children of Robb Elementary and so many other schools. We are bleeding out, and you are not there. My oath as a doctor means that I signed up to save lives. I do my job. And I guess it turns out that I am here to plead, to beg, to please, please do yours.
Thank you. We will now play the video from Mia.
My name is Mia Cedillo, and I go to Robb Elementary. We were just watching a movie, and then she got an email, and then she went to go lock the door, and he was in the hallway, and they made eye contact, and then she went back in the room and she told us, go hide, and then we went to go hide behind my teacher's desk and behind the backpacks, and then he shot the little window, and then he went to the other classroom, and then he went, there's a door between our classrooms, and he went to there and shot my teacher and told my teacher goodnight and shot her in the head. And then he shot some of my classmates and the whiteboard. When I went to the backpacks, he shot my friend that was next to me, and I thought he was gonna come back to the room, so I grabbed the blood and put it all over me. And
What did you do then when you put the blood on yourself?
just stay quiet, and then I got my teacher's phone and called 911.
And what did you tell 911?
I told her that we need help and to send the police in our classroom.
If there was something that you want people to know about that day and about you, right? Or things that you want different, what would it be?
To have security.
Do you feel safe at school? Why not?
Because I don't want it to happen again.
And you think it's going to happen again?
Mr. Soria, you're now recognized.
Hello. Today I come because I could have lost my baby girl. She's not the same little girl that I used to play with, hang around with, and do everything, because she was daddy's little girl. I have 5 kids, and she's the middle child. I don't know what to do, because I think I would have lost my baby girl. My baby girl is the world, 'cause not only once, but twice, she came back to us. She's everything, not only for me, but her siblings and her mother. I thank y'all for letting me be here and speak out, but I wish something will change, not only for our kids, but every single kid in the world, because schools are not safe anymore. Something needs to really change. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony, and I understand you are now leaving. We thank you for sharing your story. Thank you, and Mr. and Mrs. Rubio, you are now recognized for your testimony.
I am Kimberly Rubio. This is Felix Rubio. We're the parents of Alexandria Anaya, best known as Lexi Rubio, and 5 other children who all attended Uvalde Public Schools during the 2021 to 2022 school year. Calissa, who completed high school this year, Isaiah, who attends Uvalde High School, David Morales Junior High, Jalila Flores Elementary, and our 2 youngest children, Julian 8 and Lexi 10, who were at Robb Elementary. On the morning of May 24th, 2022, I dropped Lexi and Julian off at school a little after 7 a.m. My husband and I returned to the campus at 8 a.m. for Julian's award ceremony, and again at 10:30 a.m. for Lexi's award ceremony. Lexi received the Good Citizen Award and was also recognized for receiving all A's. At the conclusion of the ceremony, we took photos with her before asking her to pose for a picture with her teacher, Mr. Reyes. That photo, her last photo ever, was taken at approximately 10:54 a.m. To celebrate, we promised to get her ice cream that evening. I told her we loved her and we would pick her up after school. I can still see her walking with us toward the exit. In the reel that keeps scrolling across my memories, she turns her head and smiles back at us to acknowledge my promise. And then we left. I left my daughter at that school, and that decision will haunt me for the rest of my life. Afterward, Felix dropped me off at my office, the Uvalde Leader News, and returned home because it was a rare day off for him between normal shifts and security gigs he takes to help make ends meet. I got situated at my desk and began writing about a new business in town when the news office started hearing commotion on the police scanner, a shooting on Diaz Street near Robb Elementary. It wasn't long before we received word from my son's teacher that they were safe, secure in the classroom. Once evacuated from campus, the children were reunited with parents and guardians at the Civic Center. My dad picked up Julian from the Civic Center and took him to my grandmother's house. One of our Robb kids was safe. We focused on finding Lexi. Bus after bus arrived, but she wasn't on board. We heard there were children at the local hospital, so we drove over to provide her description. She wasn't there. My dad drove an hour and a half to San Antonio to check with the university hospital. At this point, some part of me must have realized that she was gone. In the midst of chaos, I had the urge to return to Robb. We didn't have our car at this point, and traffic was everywhere. So I ran barefoot with my flimsy sandals in my hand. I ran a mile to the school, my husband with me. We sat outside for a while before it became clear we wouldn't receive an answer from law enforcement on scene. San Antonio firefighter eventually gave us a ride back to the Civic Center, where the district was asking all families who had not been reunited with their children to gather. Soon after, we received the news that our daughter was among the 19 students and 2 teachers that died as a result of gun violence. We don't want you to think of Lexi as just a number. She was intelligent, compassionate, and athletic. She was quiet, shy unless she had a point to make. But she knew she was right. She so often was. She stood her ground. She was firm, direct, voice unwavering. So today, we stand for Lexi, and as her voice, we demand action. We seek a ban on assault rifles and high-capacity magazines. We understand that for some reason, to some people, to people with money, to people who fund political campaigns, that guns are more important than children. So at this moment, we ask for progress. We seek to raise the age to purchase these weapons from 18 to 21 years of age. We seek red flag laws, stronger background checks. We also want to repeal gun manufacturers' liability immunity. You've all seen glimpses of who Lexi was, but I also want to tell you a little bit about who she would have been. If given the opportunity, Lexi would have made a positive change in this world. She wanted to attend St. Mary's University in San Antonio, Texas, on a softball scholarship. She wanted to major in math and go on to attend law school. That opportunity was taken from her. She was taken from us. I'm a reporter, a student, a mom, a runner. I've read to my children since they were in the womb. My husband is a law enforcement officer, an Iraq war veteran. He loves fishing and our babies. Somewhere out there, there is a mom listening to our testimony, thinking, I can't even imagine their pain, not knowing that our reality will one day be hers, unless we act now. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. Ms. Hughes, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Honorable Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for allowing me to be here today to address the violence in our country. My name is Lucretia Hughes Klukin. I have 4 children and 9 grandchildren. On the night of April the 2nd, 2016, my family got a phone call that would change our lives forever. My ex-husband answered the phone and let out a blood-curdling scream, a scream of pain from the depths of his soul. He screamed, he cried, he's gone, he is gone. Our 19-year-old son, Emmanuel, went to a party early that night. After we got the call, we was frantic. We called his phone, no one answered. We called even the police. I went to Facebook and I had to ask, is my son dead? I found out that he was shot point blank in the head and killed while playing dominoes. No one spoke up for weeks, and the killer was on the run. No one was going to snitch, but that is the street life. Words can't describe how hard it is to bury a child. I ache for anyone and all who have done the same. My son's death was a result of a criminal with an evil heart and a justice system failing to hold him accountable for the laws he had already broken. You see, a convicted felon killed my son with an illegally obtained gun. Our gun control lobbyists and politicians claim that their policies will save lives and reduce violence. Well, those policies did not save my son. The laws being discussed are already implemented in cities across this country. We have decades of evidence proving they do not work. St. Louis, New York, Chicago, Washington, Atlanta are gun control utopias, and they are plagued with the most violence. 10 more laws, 20 more laws, 1,000 more won't make what has already illegal more wrong or stop criminals from committing these crimes. And y'all are delusional if you think it's going to keep us safe. I am a walking testimony of how the criminal justice system and the gun control laws, which is steeped in racism, by the way, have failed the Black community. By the age of 25, I had already went to 18 young Black men funerals at the age of 25. I have one Black man in jail, one Black man in the grave, and my young grandson gonna be raised without a father. And it's a curse on the Black community and everyone else's. Something has to change. Thoughts and prayers and calls for more gun control isn't enough. How about letting me defend myself from evil? You don't think that I'm capable and trustworthy to handle a firearm? You don't think that the Second Amendment doesn't apply to people that look like me? Who and you who would call for more gun controls are the same ones that are calling to defund the police. Who is supposed to protect us? We must prepare to be our own first responders to protect ourselves and our loved ones. I am a legal, law-abiding citizen, and I don't need the government to save me. I teach people how to use a firearm. I empower others to look at me to understand the Second Amendment is their right. I am a proud member of the DC Project, Women for Gun Rights. We believe that education is the key to safety, not ineffective legislation. We support meaningful solutions that will actually save lives. We support the Safe Student Act, H.R. 7415, which would immediately make schools safer. In hindsight, at Parkland, we saw failure of the government at every level failing the students. Students saw something and they said something, and the school did not act. Police were called to his residence over 30 times, and they did not act. And finally, the police did not go into their school that fateful day and failed to protect those kids. We need to secure our schools, and we gotta secure this building, or like y'all do. What's the difference? We call on Congress to ban gun-free zones, fund nonpartisan firearm education programs like Kids Safe Foundation and non-governmental mental health organizations like Hold My Guns. And in closing, I claim that nothing in these bills do anything to make us safer or address the mental health crisis in this country. Despite living with the heartache of losing my son on a daily basis, I believe it is our God-given right to defend ourselves from any act of violence. Making it more difficult or even more expensive for me and people that look like me and other law-abiding citizens will not make us safer. It will embolden the criminals. Gun owners are not the enemies, and these gun control policies are not the solution. Thank you, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for your powerful and meaningful and gut-wrenching testimony. We will now pause. You are excused, and we will pause while we seat the next panel for their testimony. Meeting will resume. We are now ready for our second panel, and I'd like to introduce our witnesses. The first witness is the Honorable Eric Adams, who is the mayor of the City of New York. Then we will hear from Greg Jackson, who is the executive director of the Community Justice Action Fund. Next, we will hear from Becky Pringle, who is the president of the National Education Association. Next, we will hear from Joseph Grumalia, who is the police commissioner of Buffalo, New York. Then we will hear from Nick Suplina, who is the senior vice president for law and policy at Everytown for gun safety. Finally, we'll hear from Amy Swearer, who is the legal fellow at the Edwin Meese Center for Legal and Judicial Studies in the Heritage Foundation. The witnesses will be unmuted so that we may swear them in. Please raise your right hands. Do you swear to affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Thank you. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. With that, Mayor Adams, you are now recognized for your testimony. Thank you for coming. Turn on your mic.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, I want to thank you, Madam Chairwoman Maloney, for the invitation to testify today. I also want to thank all the members of the House Committee on Oversight and Reform, members from the New York City congressional delegation, and everyone who has testified today, especially those who have so bravely shared their stories of losing loved ones to gun violence. I was particularly touched by hearing the husband and wife that lost their baby girl. As a father with one son, it was extremely impactful to all of us. I am Eric Adams, and I am honored to appear before you today as the 110th mayor of the great city of New York to discuss the ways we can protect public safety and prevent gun violence. Ladies and gentlemen, it is high noon in America. Time for every one of us to decide where we stand on the issue of gun violence. Time to decide if it's more important to protect the profits of gun manufacturers or the lives of our children. Time to decide if we are going to be a nation of laws or confederation of chaos, and we must do it now. It is high noon in America, our country, the country I love. The clock is ticking every day, every minute towards another hour of death. I'm here today to ask every one of you and everyone in this Congress to stand with all of us to end gun violence and protect the lives of Americans. We are facing a crisis that is killing more Americans than war, a crisis that is now the #1 cause of death for our young people, a crisis that is flooding our cities with illegal guns faster than we can take them off the street. The New York City Police Department has taken over 3,000 illegal guns off our streets this year alone, but the guns just keep coming. This is a crisis that transcends party lines and affects both rural and urban communities. I know this firsthand as the co-chair of Everytown's nonpartisan coalition on Mayors Against Illegal Guns. No matter what our party affiliations, we are united in our mission to stop crime, save lives, and bring an end to gun violence. Because this isn't about blue versus red. This is about right versus wrong. Whether it is on the street wearing a badge or in these chambers taking a vote, we must stand for what is right. First, we need Congress to take the handcuffs off the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, known as ATF, and let them do their jobs. That means confirming President Biden's nominee as soon as possible. And we must work together to dam all the rivers that lead to the sea of violence. Common sense gun reform must become the law of the land. I'm pleased that today the House will vote on H.R. 7910, the Protecting Our Kids Act, and I urge swift passage of the gun violence prevention package for consideration in the Senate. I also urge the Senate to pass H.R. 8, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2021, and H.R. 1446, the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2021. These are bipartisan gun safety bills that would make our cities and our people safer. I stand with President Joe Biden in calling on Congress to act now to regulate or ban assault weapons in this country. Even if we only raise the age required to buy one of these weapons, lives will be saved. And we need Congress to direct federal aid to localities and states that support not just law enforcement and violence prevention, but also access to high-quality health care, child care, education, and housing. We must build a society while youth are on a path to fulfillment, not a road to ruin. As mayor, my greatest responsibility is protecting the lives and the safety of the people of New York City. This is my calling, my duty, and my life's work. I did it as a police officer, in a uniform and wearing a badge, and I do it now as elected leader of our largest American city. But I need your help to further protect our people and to save lives. The time is act now. It's high noon in America.
Thank you. Mr. Jackson, you're now recognized for your testimony. Mr. Jackson.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and the rest of the committee for inviting me on this really important topic. My name is Greg Jackson. I'm the Executive Director for the Community Justice Action Fund, the only national gun violence advocacy organization led by a survivor of color. But I'm not here by choice. I'm here by circumstance. In 2013, just miles from this chamber, I was shot as an innocent bystander while I was simply walking home. And when I arrived at the hospital, I wasn't welcomed with nurses and surgeons. No, I was met with investigators that questioned me as a suspect first and a patient second. I spent 21 days in the hospital, 6 months learning how to walk again. But what was most terrifying and tragic was that when I turned on the TV, I was watching members of Congress have the same debates that we're having right now. That was 9 years ago. Every year, over 110,000 people are shot or killed by gun violence. So that means nearly 1 million lives have been directly devastated since I laid in that hospital, looked up at that television, and watched the members of this chamber debate this topic. Most of the stories of those who've been impacted by gun violence, like mine, will never make the headlines. You know, just 2 miles from here, Micaiah Wilson was shot 10 years old while going to get ice cream. Karan Brown, one of my mentees, who hosted his own Stop the Violence event in his neighborhood, was shot down that same summer and killed in front of a McDonald's. And Pamela Thomas, here in D.C., who was so afraid of gun violence in her community that she wrote her own eulogy just to be shot by a stray bullet in front of her son. These stats are not stats. These are stories of real people that are dying in our streets every single day. Every day, 110 Americans are killed with guns and 200 are shot or wounded. And we've talked a lot about this being the #1 cause of death for all youth, surpassing car accidents, drug overdoses, and COVID-19. But amid this pandemic, we've also seen a 35% increase in homicides. And this still remains the #1 cause of death for Black men, the #2 cause of death for Latino men, and the #2 cause of death for Black women. We are here because we cannot and must not hide from the harsh truth. Gun violence is destroying communities around the country, and every day families experience firsthand the devastation gunfire brings. To eliminate gun violence, we must swiftly recognize that this is a public health crisis that deserves a public health response. At Community Justice, we address gun violence by focusing on those who have been most impacted by the crisis. And we urge Congress to invest in community-based solutions that we know can address those public health risk factors, that can reduce the risk factors of those impacted by gun violence, but also address the root causes. But we also strongly urge that any supply-side approach not only focus on the shooter, but on the supplier and the source of firearms that are flooding into our communities. In moments of crisis, Congress has proven to be as resilient as the American people and take action. When coronavirus struck our country, Congress authorized bipartisan legislation to provide resources and regulations to save lives. When Ukraine was in crisis, Congress sprang into action and mobilized bipartisan authorization to authorize immediate aid, economic investments, mental health resources, and other services to support those communities. But I'm here to say that we are in crisis in America today. Each time, we did the hard thing because it was the right thing to do, and this crisis is no different. This crisis now has taken away grandparents in Buffalo, elementary kids in Uvalde, fathers in Chicago, mothers in Atlanta, nephews in Chicago, even pastors in Charleston. And we're here still asking for action. There are 3 direct things that we know can be done. First, we must acknowledge this as a public health crisis and craft policies to combat it as such. Second, we must advance common sense legislation that not only addresses the hardware, but promotes community-based solutions to end gun violence, such as the Break the Cycle of Violence Act. And lastly, I urge you to create a select committee on the gun violence crisis to investigate the health impacts of gun violence and its disproportionate impact on Black and brown communities across the country. Now is the time to take action before another person loses their life, before another child opens his last textbook, before another parent hugs that child for the last time, and also before someone like me isn't alive to ask you to do so. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ms. Pringle. You are now recognized for your testimony.
Good morning, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and committee members. I appreciate the opportunity to offer testimony on behalf of the 3 million members of the National Education Association and all devoted educators who teach and nurture and protect our students. As a teacher with 3 decades of experience, I am frustrated, I am heartbroken, I am angry that this is where we are 23 years after Columbine. On April 20th, 1999, I had been a middle school science teacher in Pennsylvania for 23 years. No experience or training had prepared me for the questions my middle-level learners asked me. As I joined my fellow teachers in shock and disbelief of the carnage that ended the lives of 12 students and 1 teacher, the only thing that comforted us was the belief that this society would never let it happen again. But the list continued to grow, didn't it? Virginia Tech, Sandy Hook, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, and now Robb Elementary. Kids were celebrating at the end of a successful school year. For 19 children and 2 teachers, it would be the last days of their lives. These massacres occurring in suburban, urban, and rural schools are not isolated incidents. Tallying up the number of killed or wounded children does not begin to tell the full horrific story. Camille, a student who survived Sandy Hook, experienced severe panic attacks for years. She is one of the more than 311,000 students exposed to gun violence since Columbine. Their trauma will likely endure for the rest of their lives. Students across our country are writing goodbye notes and wills just in case. Unfortunately, their fear is perfectly rational. Here in America, we are 25 times more likely to die by gun than people in other developed nations. So the question we must ask, is this who we are? Is it? Our country has already experienced nearly 240 mass shootings in 2022 alone. But that number does not begin to capture the scope of this epidemic. Every day, gun violence kills 111 people. That means that we can expect 22,255 more deaths by guns this year. Inaction equals acceptance of the unacceptable. And this crisis is worse in Black and Latino communities, where 78% of adults or their loved ones are victims of gun violence. The evidence is clear. Where there are more guns, more people are killed by guns. Every single day, the politicians who fail to take action ignore the majority of Americans who want stricter gun laws. You tell our children protecting them matters less than protecting the status quo. A high school teacher in Arlington, Texas, survived a workplace shooting in a corporate setting, only to experience school shootings himself and countless lockdowns. He is now leaving our profession with these words: "As much as I love teaching, I can't fully represent and protect my students. I am not going to be the educator they need." Enough with so-called solutions that do not address the problem. We cannot place enough armed guards at every school building in America to protect our babies. We cannot ask educators to carry weapons and wear body armor while teaching and nurturing our students. Because by the time someone has shown up with a military weapon, it is already too late. We need for our students more resources, not more revolvers. You can help us to not only heal, but to hope. Pass common sense gun control legislation so that not one more community is shattered and not one more anguished parents, like we heard today, has to lay a precious child to rest. Our children deserve the chance to grow and to thrive, to live into their brilliance. Thank you for what I know you will do for our babies.
Thank you. Commissioner Gramaglia, you are now recognized.
Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to participate in today's hearing. I appear before you today as the Police Commissioner in Buffalo, New York. It is also my privilege to testify on behalf of the Major City Chiefs Association. We're here today to discuss gun violence epidemic plaguing our nation. This hearing comes in the aftermath of multiple mass shootings that have devastated communities throughout the country, including my home city in Buffalo. Our communities are hurting, and we must continue to support them, the loved ones of the victims, and our brave first responders. On May 14th, 2022, an 18-year-old white supremacist invaded our city and inflicted terror on the Black community in a way never seen in Buffalo's history. He legally purchased a military-style weapon and body armor and then spent months practicing his shooting skills. He entered the Tops supermarket and opened fire on civilians, striking 13 and killing 10. He live-streamed this with a GoPro he had affixed to his helmet. Retired Buffalo police officer Aaron Salter Jr., who I posthumously promoted to lieutenant and issued the department's highest honor, the Medal of Honor, was working top security that day. Aaron was helping an elderly shopper leave with her groceries when the shooting began. He did his best to warn customers while in a completely defensive position. He engaged the shooter as he entered, hitting him with at least one shot. It is often said that a good guy with a gun will stop a bad guy with a gun. Aaron was the good guy and was no match for what he went up against. A legal AR-15 with multiple high-capacity magazines. He had no chance. Assault weapons like the AR-15 are known for three things: how many rounds they fire, the speed at which they fire those rounds, and body count. This radicalized 18-year-old adult should have never been able to have access to the weapons he used to perpetrate this attack, and the laws need to be enacted to ensure it never happens again. Buffalo police officers responded to tops and were able to take the shooter into custody within minutes. I have no doubt in my mind that their swift response time and handling of the situation saved lives. I would like to publicly thank them and the rest of the Buffalo Police Department for the heroism they showed on that day. Buffalo is known as a city of good neighbors. We are a resilient, culturally diverse community. We came together after this horrific tragedy, and we will continue to heal together. However, no city should have to go through this. And it is time to make changes to a system that is leaving blood on the sidewalks of our communities every day. In 2018, the MCCA adopted a firearms violence policy that would help mitigate the threat of gun violence without infringing on the constitutional rights or weakening due process. These reforms include requiring universal background checks, strengthening NICS definitions, and improving access to records, supporting the use of extreme risk protection orders, aggressively prosecuting straw purchasers and prohibited possessors, and banning assault weapons and high-capacity magazines. Polling shows the majority of Americans support these common-sense reforms, and Congress must act immediately to close the loopholes in our current system and the gaps that allow easy access to military-style weapons. Events like the Buffalo Massacre, the shooting in Uvalde that took 21 lives, including 19 children, and the mass shootings in Laguna Woods and Tulsa are the situations that capture headlines. However, we must remember that gun violence epidemic extends well beyond these events. The grim reality is that shootings have become a daily occurrence in America's cities. Emerging trends like ghost guns and guns modified with switches continue to pose a challenge for law enforcement. Congress must update our laws to account for these new threats and carnage that has accompanied them. It will be nearly impossible to address the gun violence epidemic without first addressing the underlying violent crime problem. Unfortunately, the proactive policing that helps drive down violent crime has become a luxury for many departments. Law enforcement needs additional resources to bolster its response to violent crime. An overall lack of accountability for violent offenders is contributing to rising gun violence. In some major cities, DAs are not prosecuting serial firearm offenders, and judges continue to release offenders on low or no bond. To address these challenges, Congress must provide resources for U.S. attorneys' offices to support additional federal prosecutions as appropriate. Police chiefs see the horror of gun violence every day. Members of Congress share our solemn duty to protect the public. The MCCA will continue to call on elected representatives to eschew politics and take the necessary steps to address the gun violence epidemic. Your leadership is needed now more than ever. Thank you.
Mr. Suplina, you are now recognized for your testimony. You want to turn on your mic, please?
Good morning, Chairwoman Maloney, Ranking Member Comer, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. My name is Nick Suplina. I am Senior Vice President for Law and Policy at Everytown for Gun Safety. We're the largest gun violence prevention organization in the country. I'm honored to be here today and grateful for the spotlight you're shining on America's gun violence crisis. Once again, we are grieving. Frequent public mass shootings terrorize the country and are a uniquely American problem. Mass shootings often focus the public's attention and our grief, and with good reason, but they represent a small fraction of all gun deaths in this country, which include other homicides, suicides, and unintentional shootings. Every single day, some 110 Americans are killed with a gun and 200 more are physically wounded. We estimate that 1/2 of all Americans have been touched by gun violence, either directly or someone they care for. In other words, we are a nation of gun violence survivors. To be clear, this burden is not being borne equally. I'm talking about our children. Guns are now the leading cause of death for children and teens. I'm talking about people of color. Black Americans experience 10 times the homicides of their white counterparts. Clearly, we're in the middle of a serious public health crisis, one that is crying out for sensible gun policy solutions, especially at the federal level. And while gun deaths are hitting all-time highs, the gun industry is breaking profit records year after year. The gun industry uses fear to sell guns, and it believes that mass shootings are great for gun sales. They are making money on these tragedies right now. So when we talk about the shootings in Uvalde and Buffalo, when we talk about the toll of gun violence on our children, when we talk about the disproportionate impact on Black Americans, when we talk about how gun violence costs taxpayers, survivors, families, employers, and communities $280 billion a year, we need to also talk about how the $9 billion civilian firearms industry is shielded from the scrutiny and accountability that has led other industries to better and safer practices. The gun industry, for its part, has innovated not to make guns or us safer, but to make them more dangerous, more likely to evade regulation, more profitable. Instead of designing firearms that can't be fired if stolen or that make it easy for law enforcement to trace, gun makers have created modifications to mimic automatic fire. They've created impossible to trace ghost guns that help circumvent background checks. And they've designed AR-15s that can be modified in minutes to bypass a state's assault weapons law, as we saw in Buffalo. And now, in a crowded field, gun manufacturers are trying to market in increasingly brazen ways, often touting the deadliness of products, glorifying combat, and attempting to appeal to younger and younger audiences. Finally, let's not forget the industry has done almost nothing to take steps to prevent diversion of guns into the criminal market and to gun traffickers. Between 2016 and 2020, over 1 million of the industry's firearms were recovered by law enforcement in connection to crimes. More and more of these guns carry the telltale signs that they were purchased with the intent to traffic or illegally use them. Yet the industry is rarely held accountable. This committee's investigation found a dealer in Georgia where 10% of the guns it sold ended up on crime scenes, 10%. And we wonder why it's so easy for criminals to get guns. So why is no one holding the gun industry accountable for its dangerous practices? In 2005, at the behest of the NRA, Congress passed the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which insulates the industry from most legal threats. And again, at the behest of the NRA, Congress passed the TR Amendment, a budget rider that purports to limit sharing of data about guns used in crimes, which keeps the industry out of the conversation about how criminals get armed. These laws have to go. In spite of these barriers, I'm heartened that public and private actors in legislatures, city halls, courts across the country are taking action to reveal the gun industry's role in gun violence, and I'm grateful to this committee's investigation into gun trafficking and its recent letters to gun manufacturers. I hope you have the CEOs appear here for testimony, because America hears every day from the families who have lost loved ones to gun violence, and our country deserves to hear from the CEOs who are profiting off of their loss and pain. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mrs. Swearer, you are now recognized for your testimony.
Madam Chairwoman and distinguished members.
Your mic. Mm-hmm.
Madam Chairwoman and distinguished members.
We still can't hear you. Turn your mic on. Pull it closer too.
Is that better? It says it's on.
It's not on.
The green light is on, ma'am. I will try to speak a little bit louder. Madam Chairwoman and distinguished members of Congress, my name is Amy Swearer, and I'm a legal fellow at the Heritage Foundation, where my scholarship focuses on the Second Amendment and gun violence prevention. I've testified before various legislatures after several mass shootings: Parkland, Virginia Beach, El Paso, and unfortunately, too many others. And I hope to God this is the last time I ever have to testify before a legislative body after a mass shooting again. I fear that it won't be. And I fear that it won't be because the conversation has become predictable. An unspeakably horrific event like Uvalde or Buffalo happens, reflexively, almost compulsively, come calls for Congress to pass a whole host of gun control measures, largely targeting peaceable, law-abiding citizens. Should anyone dare question the constitutionality, practicality, or even the effectiveness of any of these policies, their opposition is immediately framed as callous obstructionism, and their legitimate concerns are brushed aside as, and I quote, bullshit. Any viable alternatives are deemed frivolous without so much as a passing thought to their usefulness. And so I will once again run through all of the problems with the serious problems with commonly proposed gun control measures. It's all detailed in my written submission, which I hope you read. Semi-automatic rifles are the type of firearm least often used to commit acts of gun violence. Pistol grips and barrel shrouds don't make them any more or less deadly in the context of mass shootings. While these features can and do make a difference in the context of lawful self-defense for civilians, which is why millions of peaceable Americans own them. Standard capacity magazines are commonly possessed by law-abiding citizens for lawful purposes. The few rigorous studies on their prohibition have found that the evidence for their success at lowering rates of gun violence is inconclusive at best. The context in which mass public shootings occur renders magazine limits effectively useless at saving lives. 18 to 20-year-olds are legal adults otherwise endowed with all of the rights and duties of citizenship, including the right to keep and bear arms. Even if it were constitutionally appropriate to punish a mass of responsible young adults because a handful of them committed atrocities, the vast majority of mass public shooters are 21 or older. And then I'll repeat the same viable alternatives that would be far more effective in a far more immediate way, again detailed in the written submission that I hope you read. Take violent crime seriously under existing federal laws and encourage your state and local counterparts to do the same. Authorize schools to shift the over $100 billion in unused COVID relief funds to physical security improvements, the hiring of armed trained staff, and the hiring of licensed mental health professionals. Promote responsible gun ownership without simultaneously imposing financial burdens on gun owners or hindering their ability to immediately respond to violent threats. Invest in the nation's mental health infrastructure to combat the 2/3 of gun deaths that are suicides. And the list goes on. Now, Congressman, I am fully aware that when you are burying your child, nuanced policy discussions are irrelevant. It doesn't matter, it shouldn't matter to a fourth grader hiding under her desk, covering herself in her dead classmate's blood, whether the real problem here is a barrel shroud or the several dozen missed opportunities to intervene along the way. But it should matter to you, because you are the ones making public policy decisions. Many of you are the ones implying that a lot of victims would be alive today but for a mass shooter's pistol grip and a background check that he already passed. Many of you are the same ones mocking anybody for, quote, talking about doors, when a single locked door in Uvalde would likely have saved 21 lives, and when all of us just walked in here today into this building with its limited public access points, its one-way locking security doors, and its plethora of armed officers. What happened in Uvalde and in Buffalo is horrific. It is horrifying. No one should ever have to experience that type of unfathomable trauma. And I cannot even begin to imagine what those families are going through right now. Everybody with a soul has it shattered over acts like this. And we have seen it shattered every single time, from Columbine to Parkland to Uvalde. We did not somehow, this didn't get easier for us. We did not grow numb somewhere along the way to the reality of this. It's not as though our family members don't also teach fourth graders, or we don't also send our kids to school. It's not as though we don't also shop in grocery stores or go to country music festivals or work in hospitals, as though we don't also feel the tremendous, horrible weight of these tragedies somewhere deep inside of our souls, because we do. No, we oppose these policies precisely because the lives of these victims mattered. Because the grief of their loved ones is real. Because we all want thriving communities where families are flourishing instead of burying their children. The opposition has always been, and is still today, a genuine concern that these policies suffer from serious constitutional and practical defects, that they will not have the impact you promise people they will. And we have always proposed alternatives that would be more effective and less constitutionally suspect. What we have rarely been met with are open ears. And I hope for the nation's sake that today is different, because I would really love to never testify after a mass shooting again. Thank you.
Thank all of you for your very important testimony. I now recognize myself for questions. As a mother, it is hard to find words to express the grief and outrage I feel and others feel in this room listening to the stories from our witnesses today. No child should be cut down by a gun. Lexi Rubio should have been able to grow up, live her dreams, become a lawyer, major in math, visit Australia. 11-year-old Mia should not have been forced to cower in fear as she watched her teachers and friends massacred. And the close-knit, vibrant Jefferson Avenue community in Buffalo, many of whom came today to stand with us, should not be forced to reckon with the violent deaths of friends and loved ones gunned down by a racist with an assault weapon. We are in a crisis, but we are not powerless. Congress just needs to find the courage to act, and I hope we find it today when we pass on these sensible and vote on these sensible gun reform bills. Let's start with assault weapons. The shooters in Uvalde and Buffalo were too young to buy alcohol, but they were both purchased assault weapons legally. Ms. Pringle, as an educator, your organization represents millions of teachers, some of whom have witnessed horrific gun violence, some of whom have been murdered, and its aftermath. Would banning assault weapons save the lives of teachers and students?
It absolutely would.
There are many other common sense steps that we can take. We can strengthen background checks, raise the minimum age to buy a gun, require waiting periods. Commissioner Grimale, you are on the front lines against gun violence every day in Buffalo. Would these common sense measures save the lives of police officers and others in your community?
They absolutely would.
Mayor Adams, New York City already has adopted many gun safety measures, and you have moved quickly to take further action. But guns from other states with lax gun laws keep flowing into New York. Why is it so important that we pass federal gun safety laws?
As we indicated, we removed 3,000 guns off our streets. But in addition to that, we have witnessed an over 240% increase in what's called ghost guns. If we don't have a combined effort with the intervention items we're putting in place, the prevention, and also stop the flow, many of the guns that we're witnessing are purchased or stolen from outside our state. One gun in particular, a suspect was found with a gun and was stolen in July 27, 2020. It was used in 6 acts of violence, individual cases, shooting individuals, shooting into a random crowd. The gun found its way on the streets of New York. So it's more than what we do locally. We need assistance with the partnership of the federal government to stop the flow of guns in our cities.
Other countries have taken common sense steps to keep guns away from criminals, and they have succeeded in saving countless lives. We stand alone in the world with the number of mass shootings and deaths from guns. And as you can see in this chart, the American people overwhelmingly support gun safety reform. So, Mr. Suplina, in your view, why has Congress failed to adopt these common sense measures that most Americans and most countries in the world have adopted?
Well, to put it bluntly, Chairwoman, the gun lobby presents a formidable obstacle in this country. Oftentimes, and you've heard it already today, the Second Amendment is used as a reason to not advance common sense gun reforms, even while the court has not said that the very reforms that you're proposing would violate. Quite the opposite, the courts have upheld over and over and over again. So the lobby does what it sees as its job to make every gun law one step closer to confiscation, which is a lie. Conspiracies abound about the government coming to take your guns. And that gets into the head of well-meaning lawmakers who are afraid that people will believe that those myths are true. They're not true. We can do an awful lot to save American lives by passing these laws.
We have lost too many lives to gun violence. It's long past time for Congress to act. I now recognize the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde. Mr. Clyde.
Thank you, Chairwoman Maloney, and Ranking Member Comer for holding this hearing today so we can highlight the need for additional school security to protect our children. I join the nation in mourning for the 19 children and 2 adults who senselessly lost their lives due to an evil act committed about 2 weeks ago. While every loss of life is a tragedy, no one should weaponize or politicize the abhorrent acts to punish law-abiding citizens. For almost 250 years since the founding of our nation, countless hundreds of thousands of men and women have sacrificed their lives to provide the freedoms we enjoy today. Indeed, those freedoms were bought at a very high price and must be guarded continuously so they can be passed on to future generations. If we allow emotion to drive our actions, actions that have constitution-altering consequences, we will destroy the very foundation of our country and break faith with those who gave everything that we would be free. Evil deeds do not transcend constitutional rights. It's the other way around. Constitutional rights are the ones that transcend evil deeds. What occurred in Uvalde and other communities like Sandy Hook and Parkland was nothing short of heartbreaking tragedies and evil deeds. Heartbreaking and evil for the loss of innocent life, but also because, from what I have seen in the news about Uvalde, I believe it was mostly preventable. We don't know all the facts yet because the investigation is still ongoing, but I hope that this hearing is truly looking for legitimate, functional, and effective answers, and not just a bunch of left-wing talking points to fill the do something, do anything mentality that I have heard coming from the Biden administration. The White House press secretary, Ms. Jean-Pierre, said on Tuesday, May 31st, that President Biden is uninterested in pursuing tighter security at schools in the aftermath of the Uvalde tragedy. And I quote, "I know there's been conversation about hardening schools. That is not something that he believes in," said Ms. Jean-Pierre. One of the things I've learned during my 3 overseas tours of military combat was that the harder the target you are, the less likely you will be engaged by the enemy. That's a proven fact and just common sense that applies across multiple aspects of life. For that to not be a part of the administration's focus just shows how seriously out of touch the Democrat leadership is with reality. You know, I want to echo Mrs. Hughes' remarks from the previous panel. Schools should be hard targets. Violent criminals should never, ever have been able to gain access to the inside of these schools. That means schools across the nation should implement sensible security measures like keeping doors locked, a single point of entry, better security technology, and a volunteer force of well-trained and armed staff in addition to a school resource officer. And where a school staff person has additional responsibility, they should receive additional compensation. A retired military officer from my district, an Army colonel, sent me an email a few days ago, and I want to read a short section of it, and I quote, "I'm absolutely convinced that the single most effective method to eliminate school shootings is to take away all the signs that declare all schools are gun-free zones and do away with all laws that require such postings. Replace those signs with signs using these words or similar words. We love our children and will do anything to protect them. Accordingly, selected teachers and staff are armed and trained to protect our children. Proceed at your own peril. You will be stopped." The rationale for this dramatic change in policy is really quite simple. Gun-free zone signs don't protect anyone. They take away the law-abiding citizen's capability to be a force in helping to protect the children, and they protect the would-be shooter because they believe they will be unopposed. From June 1950 through June 2019, 94% of mass shootings occurred in gun-free zones. If a would-be school shooter doesn't know who is armed and who is not, they would likely move to a more vulnerable target. Most potential school shooters are cowards at heart. They do not want to face a challenge to what they're trying to do. They want to be in control with no opposition. They do not like to be confronted by someone who would face off against them because that confrontation would preclude a school shooter wannabe from being able to take any unopposed action. To those who say that teachers or staff will likely not take up arms to protect their students, I say they will. There have been too many documented cases where teachers have heroically given their lives to protect their students. It's time to give them the tools and help them to better protect those children so they have a fighting chance to survive an encounter with someone who is bent on harming them. And for the record, if someone is intent on harming someone else, they will use whatever is available to do the job, be it a hammer, a knife, or whatever. There's a lot of insight in the words of this Army colonel. He also knows the difference between a hard target and a soft, easy target, and he knows the advantage of that difference. Ms. Ware, you were involved in Heritage Foundation's School Safety Initiative, which was developed after the 2018 Parkland shooting, correct?
Yes, sir.
In your opinion, what do you believe should be done to secure our schools from violent criminals to ensure that our students have a safe place to learn?
Well, I think there are, as I mentioned in my testimony and then again in my written submission, there are several avenues that can be taken, including physical security improvements. Again, it has become popular to mock people for talking about doors and those sorts of things, but these are basic security components of the rest of our everyday lives. We see them in apartment complexes. We see them in the building we walked into today. We see them in most corporate buildings that we walk into in any given day. In terms of having a quicker armed response, I think schools should have the flexibility to decide how that happens. If you look in my written submission, in a footnote, there are, just from the last couple of years, a good number of examples, and it's just a smattering of them because I didn't want the footnote to be 12 pages, of armed responses saving lives, whether from school resource officers or from, including in one case, from an armed staff member who stopped a kidnapping and then prevented an armed individual from entering the school where other children were. And I think, again, component of this is not just looking at physical security, but also, as plenty of witnesses have mentioned, having the adequate mental health resources. We're not talking about blaming mental illness, but we are talking about, when you look at one, what it means for human.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I would end by saying, looking at licensed mental health professionals in schools.
Thank you very much. I yield back.
The gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Lynch, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for holding this hearing. I want to thank the panel of distinguished witnesses. Thank you for coming before this committee to help us with our work. I also want to thank the previous panel, the families of the victims who had the courage and selflessness, I think, to, despite their pain, come here with the sole purpose of preventing other families from suffering a similar loss. So I thank them. Madam Chair, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit for the record a report and analysis conducted by Cochrane, Bui, Alicia Palapiano, and Margot Sanger-Katz over at the New York Times. It's an analysis of 106 mass shootings since Columbine in this country. And I want to read an excerpt. It describes best what they found. To quote this report, if the key gun control proposals now being considered in Congress had been law since 1999, 4 gunmen younger than 21 would have been blocked from legally buying the rifles they used in mass shootings. At least 4 other assailants would have been subject to a required background check instead of slipping through a loophole. 10 others might have been unable to steal their weapons because of the efforts required to encourage safer gun storage. And 20 individuals might not have been allowed to legally purchase the large capacity magazines that they use to upgrade their guns, helping them to kill, on average, 16 people each. Taken together, those 4 measures might have changed the course of at least 35 of those 106 mass shootings, a third of such episodes in the United States since the massacre at Columbine High School in Colorado. That New York Times analysis has found. And those 35 shootings killed 446 Americans. Mr. Suplina, there's been referrals made, or references made to the fact that someone could cause damage with a hammer or a knife. I would wonder if you could talk about AR-15 style firearms and their ammunition and how different they are and the greater vulnerability it creates in society. You talk about, I know you've written on this in the past, and if you could go over that for a bit, just to educate people who are not familiar with that type of weapon.
So this type of weapon, which is derived from a military a military weapon, presents increased risk, as I believe the commissioner said earlier, because of their speed of bullet, their handling, their ability to accept high-capacity magazines, and they are designed and are advertised to be able to inflict a mass amount of damage in a short period of time. They are also unique in the damage that is done to the human body when you use one of these. A handgun, even at a sometimes larger caliber, won't do the damage to human tissue. I'm not a physician, but you did hear from one earlier who described in great detail what a semi-automatic rifle with multiple rounds can do. So these are unique threats. There's a reason why they are used in mass shootings, because those shooters want to inflict maximum damage.
Thank you. I do want to add a quote from a trauma surgeon at the University of Arizona who agrees with your assessment. He said that the damage for an AR-15 on the body, quote, looks like a grenade went off in there. Madam Chair, I am so sorrowful for the loss of Lexi Rubio and so many others, and so many we've heard in previous mass shootings, that I will support the package of restrictions that we will consider in the next couple of days here in Congress to restrict the use of assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, and I'll vote for the background checks that I think are necessary. And I respect my colleagues' rights to defend the Second Amendment. But I will note when in defending the Second Amendment, you have to go to military experts and battlefield commanders for advice on how to protect our kids while they're in school. We got a problem. We've got a problem. Think about that you're going to military battlefield commanders, combat veterans, for advice on how to protect our kids while they're sitting in school trying to learn. I just urge my colleagues to think hard on this and consider supporting the package of bills that we have before the Congress this week. Thank you, and I yield back.
Many yields back. The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Sessions, is now recognized.
Madam Chairman, thank you very much, and I want to thank the gentleman from Kentucky, the ranking member, for really what I think is a thoughtful opportunity for us to handle what is a difficult circumstance. I'm a Texan, and I was about some 100 miles from Uvalde. I know Uvalde very well. I spent a good bit of time in San Antonio growing up. As soon as I heard about what happened, I immediately went about convening some 10 counties worth of superintendents, mayors, county judges, law enforcement people, sheriffs, deputy sheriffs, school resource officers. I did not sit back and wait to find out what this hearing might develop. I did not wait to find out what someone else thinks is a good idea. I tend to think that back home, people have the best answers. I say it differently. I think Texans have answers for Texas problems. Madam Chairman, I do not want to chastise anybody today. I want to thank each of our people who have showed up, not only from Buffalo, but from New York City and others who have taken time to be here today. I do not wish to challenge anyone, but Madam Chairman, I would like to enter into the record an article from the Christian Science Monitor Weekly, June 11th, and also an article which I have provided to you from 538, which is a website that they present information. For the panel, the 538 article said, "We've known how to prevent a school shooting for more than 20 years.
Okay, without objection.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. In fact, as I went about looking at this, which I had not previously, I did a good bit of review myself, and I found out that there is the National Center for School Safety. It's at the University of Michigan in the School of Public Health. And they state this before and still, and I quote, "The information that we do have access to, these studies, seem to be saying that yes, by developing a positive school climate, by educating students on how to say something and speak up or find a trusted adult, is having a positive effect, not just on attitudes, but also self-efficiency, something we need to approach as we talk about behavior." We learned at my meeting that I had in Waco, Texas, that this is not a decision that these shooters, by and large, make that's a snap judgment. They go about this planning effort and plan these school shootings out. They happen to people who have become isolated in school, have been picked on, been made fun of, have been bullied, and these people go off into, by and large, a deep hole where they are not able to effectively balance their lives. This is a public issue problem in our schools of mental health issues. I go to schools probably every 2 weeks, and my observations that I have publicly stated are that I have seen our schools, there are a lot of children, a lot of young adults who are tested in ways where I think they're reaching out for help. I think one of the things that we should go to is looking at these studies that have been out here, and I would hope our schools and our experts that are on these panels today, including you, Chief, and including you, Mayor, would include these studies and go back to the schools and let's identify in our schools where there is something we can make better. This article also says a work in projects and in progress, and it talks about how talking to students every day. When I grew up, we would recite the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, taking a few minutes. And I know we've heard testimony that everything about America is racist, but I think that in our classrooms, we need to talk about our nations, our rights and our responsibilities, but taking time every day to be nice to each other, leaving notes, knowing each other, and then listening to people who emanate and identifying people who have problems. It is my hope, Madam Chairwoman and our ranking member, that instead of taking to the floor this immediate action, we would really listen to you and other experts. And Madam Chairman, I would like to see if we would call Justin Hines, who is Director of National Center for School Safety, Assistant Professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. I believe we need professionals who have studied these things. I say this as an opportunity to each one of you. I want to thank you. We listen to you, and I hope you will hear us back. Thank you very much, and may God bless the people of Uvalde, Texas, who are struggling through this at this time, and our nation. Madam Chairman, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Krishnamurthy, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Gramaglia, thank you for your service to the people of Buffalo. I was born in India, and I immigrated first to Buffalo, New York. And so the fact that you said that it's a city of good neighbors is very poignant for me. And I'm very sorry for the loss of all those lives in Buffalo. The shooter in Uvalde used what's called a Daniel Defense DDM V7 rifle. It's a style of AR-15 rifle. It markets that rifle as, quote, a perfect rifle for everybody. This particular picture comes from their Twitter account on May 16th, 2022. Now, Commissioner, guns are the leading cause of death for young people aged 24 and under. Guns kill far more kids than cigarettes, but we don't let cigarette companies market to children. Sir, you don't think it's appropriate for Daniel Defense or any manufacturer to market AR-15 style rifles or handguns or any other weapons to children, correct?
I think that picture behind you is very disturbing, is what it is. And no, I don't believe that that should be the case.
And why do you find that picture disturbing?
How many children in our country because of a lack of safe storage on weapons have either accidentally taken their own lives or somebody else in that household or another friend within that house who was there visiting. It's disturbing.
Shortly after the Daniel defense rifle was used in the Uvalde shooting, this picture was taken down from their Twitter account, and indeed their Twitter account was made private. I think they had second thoughts about advertising in this manner as well. Ms. Swearer, in 2019, while testifying before the House Judiciary Committee, you went viral in a viral video talking about the lethality of AR-15s. You said, quote, "Your mother struggled to hit a stationary target from 6 yards out under ideal conditions, and then she picked up an AR-15, and I watched my mother put a fist-sized grouping of lead in the center mass of the target 20 yards out. When accuracy and stopping power matter, they are simply better." You said that, correct, Ms. Swearer?
Yes, I did.
This is a picture of the 19 children and 2 teachers who died in Uvalde, Ms. Swearer. You mentioned the AR-15 stopping power, but I gotta believe these little children were not the ones you were talking about stopping, correct?
No, I was talking about stopping the individual who showed up to shoot them.
And the
Who did show up to shoot them, who did show up to shoot that individual, was a bunch of law enforcement officers with an AR-15.
and Ms. Swearer, your mic's not on, but
The green light is on.
I can hear you, Ms. Swearer. It's good. I can hear Ms. Swearer.
Perhaps you could switch with Mr. Saplina for a minute if his mic is working.
Can you please suspend the time?
The witness needs to be heard.
Restore the time, please.
Thank you.
Congressman.
Can I repeat the question and then you can say the answer?
Yeah, and if we could just stop the clock for a minute, because we lost some time there.
Could we change the placards too, Mr. Chairman?
Mr. Chrismorthy, did you want to repeat the question?
Yes. Ms. Swearer, when you talked about the stopping power of these AR-15s, it wasn't these children that you were talking about stopping, obviously.
No, I was referring to individuals like the one who went into that building and spent 78 minutes shooting them, and I hope, as was the case in Uvalde, that the people who show up to stop shooters like that have the AR-15 precisely for its stopping power, and that is exactly what happened in Uvalde. That is why cops are routinely exempt from these prohibitions.
This man legally purchased these AR-15 rifles, correct? And in this particular case, the shooter had legally purchased these AR-15 rifles and was able to stop and obviously end these lives forever.
Yes,
now,
if you
Commissioner
Gramaglia,
I want to address you again, Commissioner. You know, guns are often billed as essential to maintaining the freedoms we enjoy in America. They are an iconic part of America to a lot of people, but cars have long been central to American life as well. And what we've seen, interestingly, is that here's a picture of traffic deaths versus deaths from firearms. And at one time, traffic deaths far exceeded firearms in 1950, but over time, traffic deaths have gone down, while firearm deaths have remained relatively constant. Now, of course, with regard to the right to bear arms, that's in the Constitution, but it's not an absolute right. That's why we outlaw machine guns and we regulate firearms in other ways. Sir, with regard to traffic deaths in cars, the imposition of rules and regulations and laws, along with private industry adopting safer ways to drive and devices to make them safer, have led to a reduction in traffic deaths. But the same cannot be said for firearms. Isn't that right?
I believe you're correct, yes. In looking at the traffic deaths going down, regulations both in vehicle safety, airbags, speed enforcement, other things of that nature have led to safer roads.
And what would that lead you to believe should happen with regard to firearms?
Some sensible regulations to limit the carnage that's happening on our streets.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Thank you. Gentlelady from North Carolina, Ms. Fox, is recognized for her 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The horrific and heartbreaking tragedies that occurred in Uvalde and Buffalo have shaken the nation. We're all made in God's image, and I continue to pray for our society and for the families of the men and women and children who were senselessly murdered. We must be thoughtful in how we discuss and address this issue. When the federal government acts in haste, the room for error is exponentially compounded. This problem should be diagnosed in its entirety before we endeavor to place proposals on the table. The simple truth is that top-down legislative actions from Washington do not provide the states the due deference they deserve. The latitude of the states to make decisions that best suit their constituencies must be respected. The Second Amendment was intended both to empower individuals and also to shield them from the federal government exerting undue influence. Unfortunately, over time, the underlying principle of the Second Amendment has been distorted and misconstrued by Washington bureaucrats who simply want it stripped away from law-abiding citizens. This cannot be allowed to happen. I now yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde, who has a tremendous amount of experience with these issues.
Thank you very much, Virginia. I would like to ask Mr. Gramaglia, in your sworn testimony, you say of retired Buffalo police officer Aaron Salter, Jr., his service weapon was no match for the military-style weapons and armor the perpetrator was equipped with. Yet your Buffalo police officers responded to Tops a minute after receiving the 911 call and were able to take the shooter into custody within a minute of arriving at the scene. That's impressive. That's very impressive that your officers were able to do that. And this gentleman armed with an AR-15 style rifle. What is the Buffalo officer's standard service weapon?
A Glock 40 caliber.
A Glock 40 caliber pistol.
Yes.
So they responded with a Glock 40 caliber pistol and were able to subdue this gentleman in 1 minute.
They were able to do that because as he exited the store, he had the AR-15 pointed up underneath his chin, and then through what I thought was very calm de-escalation language, he surrendered his weapon and put it down. Had he pointed it at the officers, we think we would have had a different scenario here.
Okay, but that 40 caliber weapon is completely capable of stopping someone with an AR-15, correct?
Well, he had military-style body armor and a tactical helmet on. He was shot at least one time that we had uncovered through our evidence, and that had no effect on him. I also watched the video, both the store surveillance video that has not been released and the GoPro video that was downloaded, which showed the confrontation between.
But the 40 caliber pistol that the officers carry is plenty enough to stop an armed shooter, correct? It's all about shot placement, isn't it?
It is and it isn't.
All right, thank you, I appreciate that. Mrs. Swearer, actually, have mass shootings or school shootings been carried out with other weapons other than AR-15s?
Yes, Congressman, they have.
Okay. What other weapons? And what's the primary weapon, if you will?
So the primary weapon is actually a plurality are handguns alone. Another sort of larger segment are several variations of firearms, some combination of rifles, handguns, shotguns, and then a smaller percentage are rifles alone.
Okay, thank you very much. So handguns are still very, very potent firearms. Madam Chairwoman, I would like to introduce this article into the record, and I request unanimous consent. It's a Fox News article, May the 28th, 2022, and it's entitled, "West Virginia Woman with Pistol Shoots Kills Man at Graduation Party, Saves Several Lives."
Without objection.
All right, thank you. You know, what happened in Uvalde was an incredible tragedy, and it had a very terrible ending. But something very similar happened the very next day, that Wednesday, in Charleston, West Virginia. And a particular woman in West Virginia fatally shot a man who had begun firing an AR-15 rifle into a crowd of dozens. The woman was attending a West Virginia party. She drew her pistol and fired on the convicted felon. No one at the party was injured. and the gentleman obtained his weapon illegally. Criminals will obtain their weapons however they want. They will get them illegally. More gun laws are not going to stop that, not in any way, shape, or form, because criminals simply do not obey the law.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Madam Chair.
I yield back.
I'd like to ask permission to insert into the record an article, Why Do Something Won't Work, from the Wall Street Journal, Thursday, June 2nd, 2022. Thank you.
Without objection. The gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Conley, is now recognized.
I thank the chair, and I thank our witnesses for being here today. I was the chairman of Fairfax County when the Virginia Tech massacre occurred. At that point in American history, that was the worst gun massacre in our history. I buried 6 young children, students, that week. 6. I'm still in touch with many of the families years later. And the emptiness in their hearts and souls cannot be filled. It is a tragedy that lives with them forever. Those children were killed by a mentally ill person who should not have had access to weapons, but did. He wasn't a criminal. He was mentally ill. We hear excuse after excuse that gun laws don't work. The Australian experience would suggest otherwise. After a series of massacres in that country, Australia adopted some strict gun laws. They don't have the massacres weekly we do. It changed behavior because it changed access to weapons and ammunition. We've heard the answer is arm our teachers. That would be the solution. Ms. Pringle, you deal with teachers. Would that be a good solution from your point of view?
Absolutely not. We know that the majority of not only our teachers, but our parents do not believe that arming teachers would in any way prevent the carnage that we have seen for over 23 years. I just want you to imagine, I was a middle school teacher. My responsibility was to ensure that every student was nurtured and that they could learn, come to school ready to learn every day. And now the suggestion that I, as a teacher, would be responsible for carrying a weapon and making a split moment decision about whether I was going to shoot someone or not, whether that responsibility would be mine to bear, that is a distraction from what we know we need to do in this country, which is to pass comprehensive gun control laws, something we have never done. In the short time that we did ban assault weapons, we saw that carnage go down, didn't we? Yes, we did. But we've never passed comprehensive gun legislation in this country.
Thank you.
We need to do it now.
Mayor Adams, welcome. Mayor Adams, you're the mayor of, I think, the largest city in the United States.
Yes.
Would it be a good idea from your point of view as the mayor of that city and your commitment to reducing crime in that city to arm our teachers in all of your schools in New York City? Would that be a solution from your point of view?
No, and I think the facts show that. Between 1996 to 2010, one study found that police officers were 3 times more likely to die from gun violence with a heavy flow of guns in their city. So it's harmful to the law enforcement community, it's harmful to our civilians, and it's harmful to our children.
Mr. Gramaglia, Police Commissioner, would arming teachers help your force? Would it have made a difference in your community in Buffalo?
I think what we have to be careful on is to not militarize our schools and make students feel like they are in a system where they are surrounded by weapons in an institution where they're supposed to be learning. I certainly agree with that, hardening our targets, making sure our schools are safe buildings, having a strong school resource program where school resource officers are engaging with their students, are building trust within their students. But I think we have to, caution against over-weaponizing our schools. It causes fear in our students, and I think we need to engage our students in these conversations.
And just real quickly, and Ms. Pringle's point, the use of weapons and the decision to use them for law enforcement could be a split-second judgment, and that requires careful training, does it not?
It's a considerable amount of training for absolute split-second decisions that are second-guessed for years on.
Thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Heiss, is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Heiss.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just for the record, from what I can research and understand, there are some 300,000 or so crimes committed every year, violent crimes in which guns are a part of the situation. There are between 500,000 and 3 million incidences a year where guns prevent violent crimes from taking place. So let's clarify here, the issue is not gun violence. Guns are not the issue. We have a people violence problems who misuse guns and other means whenever they intend to harm individuals. And the answer to this situation, when you have violent people, the answer is not defunding the police. The answer is not pitting one group of Americans against another, which we see far too often these days. The answer is not ignoring the rule of law. The answer is not releasing criminals into our streets or allowing them into our country. The answer is not a lack of consequences for those who commit crimes and being soft on crime for those who commit violent crimes. We have got to look at the problem, which is violent people. And at some point in this country, we've got to recognize that there is great value in upholding the rule of law. We've got to recognize and teach that there is a such thing as moral absolutes, not the least of which is respecting one another and respecting life. We've got to, in the midst of this conversation, I believe, embrace religious beliefs. Look, there are risks that come with a free society. We all understand that. But we have a moral and a spiritual crisis in this country right now, and that is reflected in violent people that we see more and more. But it is impossible for us to have a system of government, which we have in this country, where we have limited government and maximum freedom, if we do not have a citizenry that is capable of self-governing their own lives with an authentic understanding of right and wrong. And so for us to take out of the equation any mention of moral absolutes or the role that our founders mentioned and described as indispensable supports to our system of government, which is morality, religion and morality, then I believe we're making a mistake in all of this discussion. These things cannot be ignored. Mayor Adams, let me real quickly begin with you, and if we can go quickly. New York City is certainly one of the leading examples of gun restrictions and gun restrictive measures in the United States. Yes or no? Your mic was off.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
And yet, we all know New York has continued in recent years to see a rise in crime. Yes or no?
Yes.
Okay. In January of this year, you released in a press statement regarding your blueprint to end gun violence in New York City. You had in that a quote that says this: "It is illegal to carry a gun in our city, yet police officers take them off the streets every day in record numbers." You made that statement correct?
Yes, and many comes from Georgia.
Right. And so here we still have, in a city that has the greatest among the greatest gun restriction laws in the country, a rise in crime and guns being carried off the streets in record numbers every day, it doesn't appear that the attempts that are produced by the gun restrictions are having any effect of keeping bad people from getting guns, and taking the constitutional rights away from American citizens only helps criminals, is I guess what I'm getting to. Ms. Swearer, let me come to you. If we continue down this path of restricting gun rights from American citizens, making it easier for criminals to have targets, knowing that there will not be guns by legal citizens there to defend themselves, what kind of impact will that have in the long run?
First, I want to make sure that, is my mic still not on?
Can we put a pause?
Use your neighbor's mic. Use your neighbor's mic. Maybe that'll work better.
My apologies. I was told the issue had been taken care of. Congressman, to answer your question, criminals are rational actors. You look at the studies on this and the way in which criminals operate. Obviously, they don't want to confront someone with a firearm any more than we would want to if we were criminals. They are rational actors. You mentioned the statistics on defensive gun uses. I think that is important to point out. I would also note how much lower that is, considering there are a number of states that essentially do not allow ordinary law-abiding citizens to protect themselves with firearms in public, and or who make it far more difficult for individuals to keep and bear arms even inside their own homes, and so that could be considerably higher under different circumstances. That said, again, I appreciate you pointing that out, but again, criminals are rational actors. To pretend otherwise is borderline silly. So of course,
Gentleman's time has expired.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Raskin, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Buffalo, Uvalde, Sandy Hook, Tree of Life, Mother Emanuel Church, El Paso, Walmart, Pulse Nightclub, Las Vegas, Columbine. The bloodbath continues. In the history of our species, a number of civilizations have practiced or allowed human sacrifice, including the sacrifice of children. The Carthaginians, the Mesopotamians, the Incas, the Aztecs. Will we be recorded as such a society that accepts the sacrifice of innocence? Gun violence is the #1 cause of death of children in the United States of America today, which makes us globally unique. We have rates of gun violence and gun death 20 times higher than other industrialized nations like France, the United Kingdom, Israel, Norway, Sweden, Japan. No other nation comes close to what we see here, even though we have comparable levels of mental health problems and mental illness. Will we continue to accept the slaughter of innocents, including innocent children, as acceptable collateral damage for loyalty to a completely bogus and distorted misreading of the Second Amendment and what the Supreme Court has said about it? Justice Scalia in the Heller decision was emphatic that reasonable gun safety regulation is perfectly consistent with the Second Amendment right. Justice Scalia said he specifically rejected the view advanced by a number of our colleagues today, saying that the right of gun ownership is not unlimited. No, Justice Scalia stated the Second Amendment right is, quote, not a right to keep and carry any weapon whatsoever, in any manner whatsoever, and for whatever purpose. He enumerated a partial list of reasonable regulations, including a ban on carrying concealed weapons, the possession of firearms by felons, the mentally ill, and other dangerous people, laws forbidding the carrying of firearms into schools, in government buildings, and other public places, laws imposing the conditions and qualifications on the sale of firearms, such as background checks. All of these things, he has said, are perfectly consistent with the Second Amendment right. It's not different from other rights we have, like the First Amendment, where you have an absolute right to speak, but you don't have a right to set up a demonstration with loudspeaker system in front of the White House at 2 o'clock in the morning and keep the president's family up. We accept reasonable time, place, manner regulations with respect to all rights. Now, our colleagues invite us to believe the Second Amendment is some kind of policy straitjacket, but they won't read or quote the decision by Justice Scalia himself, who wrote the most elaborate defense and explication of the majority's view of the Second Amendment in D.C. versus Heller in 2008. Mr. Suplina, in 2005, Congress gave the gun industry unprecedented and unique immunity from civil lawsuits for crimes committed with their products. No other industry's got anything like that. Could you explain what that immunity protection means for the gun industry and how it has blocked common sense laws to end gun violence in our country?
Yes, Congressman, thank you. The law of PLACA, which you cite, has given near blanket immunity to the gun industry, and the result has really had a profound impact on what we know about the gun industry's role in gun violence, as well as any accountability for the industry. So acts that would have led to either litigation that would have exposed truths like happened with the tobacco industry, or accountability like happened in the automobile industry, safety practices that would have improved at these manufacturers because there was a risk of doing nothing, just simply does not exist with the gun industry.
What reckless marketing and sales practices has the gun industry engaged in because of this blanket of immunity that has been bestowed upon them?
Well, you know, there are several, and the marketing is getting increasingly reckless, increasingly desperate as the field gets more crowded, but also in terms of distribution practices. I've heard several times today about how easy it is for criminals to get guns, as if that's some act of magic, but these guns are all starting with gun manufacturers and gun sellers. We know that certain gun manufacturers are fueling gun shops that are selling disproportionately into illegal markets. And the gun industry is protected by PLACA because they say, oh, we're following the law. Well, the numbers speak for themselves.
Okay, and then finally, Chief, you were interrupted before. What do you make of this claim that we shouldn't have laws governing, for example, a universal criminal background check because criminals don't follow the law? Is that an argument against having any law against murder, rape, assault, because criminals by definition don't follow the law?
The gentleman's time has expired, but the gentleman may answer.
So the universal background checks is a simple process that's going to have those that want to legally obtain their guns with their constitutional rights to obtain those guns. Criminals absolutely are not going to follow that. But the more guns that we keep flooding in without background checks, without proper adherence to get those guns through straw purchases and other manners, that's how we're flooding the market so that criminals can obtain those guns.
And Justice Scalia emphasized that there could be regulations
gentleman's time
on
has
commercial
expired.
Thank you. I yield.
The gentleman from Texas, Mr. Fallon, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, we hold hearings on all sorts of topics for all sorts of reasons. Sometimes for political reasons, or even worse, sometimes for political theater aimed at attaining political currency which will then be spent on winning an upcoming election. Other times, hearings are held to actually solve a problem. We're here today because of the tragedies in Buffalo and the horrific loss of life in my home state of Texas and Uvalde, which is a beautiful American community ripped apart by a troubled and evil coward. Now, when lives are lost and innocence is stolen, particularly when children are the victims, it's natural to want to assess and focus blame. Who did this and how did this happen? And I'm no different than any American. I'm heartbroken and I'm furious. Those innocent children are gone, and the indescribable suffering of the families is beyond words. We have a president that says continually that he must do something. We must do something. Many Democrats are echoing that. We must do something. No, we need to do something effective that will keep our children safer. As I mentioned, when a senseless tragedy like this happens, blame's thrown around. Some people want to blame guns. Some people want to blame gun manufacturers. Some people want to blame, believe it or not, the Constitution. Some people want to blame an entire political party. And all this couldn't be more misplaced. The shooter is the only one to blame. So when the president and many Democrats are claiming that guns are the problem and the readily available supply is the culprit, Well, the more guns in America, the argument goes, the more dangerous America becomes. But the actual facts belie this thinking. In 1969, so about 50 years ago, there were 180 million firearms in this country. Today, it's about double. In 2019, it was about 365 million. Yet the murder rate back then was 9.6 per 100,000. The murder rate now is 5, or in 2019 anyway, it was 5 per 100,000. So twice the number of guns, and yet murder rate was cut in half. The truth is that guns have always been readily available in this country. But mass shootings, and in particular mass shootings of schools, were non-existent or at least extremely rare until they became a grisly recent phenomenon. So what's changed in the last 50 years? There's been a noticeable breakdown of the family, there's been an erosion of faith, and there's been a seismic drop in social interactions in large measure due to the overuse of these dang smartphones and the proliferation of social media, which is probably better described as anti-social media. Senseless mass shootings are not committed by well-adjusted, successful, socially polished people. They're committed by disturbed, unstable loners with mental disease.
By the end of the year, so we started in October.
Madam Chair, can I get my time back?
Yes.
Thank you.
Rule out what we don't want.
Thank you. Senseless mass shootings are committed by unstable, disturbed loners with mental disease. Refusing to address better mental health services, especially for young people, is to do a disservice at best, and it's a dereliction at duty at worst. The focus, sadly, by the Democrats is to restrict guns or prohibit their legal possession entirely. A Democratic member of Congress in a committee hearing just recently said, and I quote, "We will not rest until we have taken weapons of war out of circulation in our communities." So, do restrictive gun laws or prohibitions work? The most dangerous nations on the planet, according to the World Bank and the UN, are El Salvador, Jamaica, Venezuela, and Honduras. And what else do they have in common? It's also nearly impossible for an average citizen to own a firearm, and yet they are terribly perilous places to be. Believe it or not, some Democratic-controlled cities in our country with restrictive gun laws are even more dangerous than the aforementioned countries. St. Louis has a higher murder rate than El Salvador. Baltimore does as well, and Detroit is a more lethal and dangerous place to go and visit or live than Venezuela. So does passing prohibitions, I mean, it just simply doesn't work. Doing something doesn't work. Doing something effective is the path that we should and must take. History's shown us when you disarm law-abiding citizens, you create not more safety, but more peril. The inconvenient truth for some on this committee and in this chamber is that more firearms in the hands of law-abiding citizens make us all safer. So let's talk some real solutions. We must harden our schools with controlled access and single point of entry with a tiered entry procedures. The main office should be located directly by the front door, which is single access entry. Classroom doors should automatically shut and lock like hotel room doors do. Let's support and foster a robust school marshal program where qualified and volunteer teachers and staff go through proper training to be armed on campus. Let's increase the number of SROs in our schools. Let's leverage technology by putting cameras in schools, much like Frisco, Texas did 15 years ago when I was on a city council. And they had a command center and a mobile command center, and any threat could be immediately detected, tracked, and eliminated forthwith. We need a rapid response plan and a rapid response force to be trained to world-class standards. And also, law enforcement doctrine must change, so when there is a threat, the schools aren't besieged, but rather our heroes in blue advance, using honed techniques and teamwork and technology, and eliminate the threat as soon as possible. Our goal should be to protect our children. No parent, educator, citizen, legislature, or nation has a higher calling. Let's look at real and effective solutions and shelve the divisive rhetoric, because American children deserve nothing less. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman from California, Mr. Rokan, is now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Like so many on this committee and around the country, I was deeply moved, not as a politician, as a father, by the testimony this morning of the families of victims. Kimberly Rubio, who lost her precious daughter Lexi, cut through all the talking points, all the debate, and asked the central question before our Congress and our country. As she put it, what do we value more, children or our guns? It's really that simple. I want to talk about the common sense reforms on guns, but as representative of Silicon Valley, I feel I also have a duty to talk about some of the role of social media in this massacre. With the Uvalde shooter on Instagram having a group chat where there is conversation of school shootings, where there's conversation of threats of violence, where he's bragging about getting assault weapons, why is there no action? And let's be very clear, these are minors. He was a minor when he did this. It's not the same free speech rights. Mr. Suplina, do you think companies like Instagram should have some responsibility in group chats when minors are involved and you have explicit discussion of school shootings to do something?
I think the role of social media companies is an important one, and you're right to point it out, Congressman. Instagram, Facebook, these are often where we see the earliest warning signs of a potential mass shooter, as well as other social media platforms where these instances are discussed. There's often multiple people in the chat. And I do want to also mention, with respect to the Buffalo shooter, for instance, he cited YouTube for the videos that allowed him to modify the firearm that he had to accept a detachable magazines, which he used to deadly effect. So social media companies do have a role to play here.
And just like my colleague, Mr. Raskin, said that the right of the Second Amendment is not absolute, it's important to recognize that the right of the First Amendment is not absolute. Under Brandenburg, you can't have things that incite violence, and there are greater protections for minors. I mean, it is crazy to me that you can have people under 18 talking about shootings and mass shootings, and these companies are taking no action. So we need to have regulation that gets to the heart of this. You know, Mrs. Swearer, I'm trying to understand your position, and I just want to ask you some simple yes or no questions to understand where you're coming from. Is it your view that someone who has committed a violent felony should be able to purchase a gun, yes or no?
No.
Is it your view that someone who's a serial rapist should be able to purchase a gun, yes or no?
Very clearly, no.
Is it your view that someone who is a drug trafficker should be able to purchase a gun, yes or no?
No, and these are becoming insulting.
And so, well, I mean, so would you support any laws that would make sure that violent felons, serial rapists, or people who are drug traffickers will not get access to guns?
If they are written and narrowly tailored to approach that issue without burdening the rights of law-abiding citizens or criminalizing low-risk transfers between responsible citizens, yes, I'm more than willing to look at that law.
That is exactly what the background checks, I mean, because right now what you have a case is that the background checks do not cover a lot of the sales to violent felons, to serial rapists, and I just want to be clear, when the Republican Party, their position right now by opposing H.R. 8 is they are for violent felons, serial rapists still being able to purchase these guns.
No, they're not.
Yes, they are.
No, they're not. They're against low-risk transfers being criminalized.
Please, I'm reclaiming my time.
Point of order, Madam Chair. The position of Republicans is that violent criminals be in jail.
Well, no, the position is...
Madam Chair, the gentleman has not stated a valid point of order.
The position, H.R. 8, all H.R. 8 at its core said is that violent felons are still getting these guns. Serial rapists are still getting these guns. And the law and order party that has demagogued the issue of law enforcement and policing, that party is saying, we're okay with violent felons still getting these guns. We're okay with serial rapists still getting these guns. And all the Congress on the Democratic side is trying to do is to close those loopholes.
I respectfully refer you to my testimony on this very bill before the Senate Judiciary Committee last year, where I explained how that is a grotesque mischaracterization of our opposition to that bill.
I am saying that there is not...
The gentleman's time has expired.
Well, she kept interrupting me.
Okay, all right. But then, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Keller, is now recognized.
I would first like to take a moment to thank all our panelists, this panel and the previous panel, for your testimony. We've seen some horrific acts in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. We saw a devastating shooting in Philadelphia on Saturday, and I continue, and we all should offer prayer for the families across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and across our nation that have been affected by these acts committed by violent criminals
skyrocketing crime in our cities. That's what we need to focus on. New York City saw a 16.2% increase in violent criminals shooting others in March of 2022. That's up from a year before. San Francisco saw a 31% rise in homicides. In Chicago, violent criminals were responsible for shooting 47 people on Memorial Day weekend alone. There's a trend here. Crime is rising in cities that have the most restrictive laws on firearms and have the least severe criminal enforcement penalties on the books. And in fact, cities that don't enforce the laws that are on the books. The district attorney in San Francisco has dismissed over 40% of felony convictions since 2020. And in Philadelphia, homicides have increased 58% during District Attorney Larry Krasner's tenure. However, only 21% of crimes when violent criminals shot another person since 2015 have led to criminal charges, and less than 1/10 of those incidents resulted in convictions. Philadelphia police are making record amounts of arrests for crimes committed by violent people with guns. Yet Krasner's office has dismissed or withdrawn more violent cases every year he has been in office. The bottom line is when you fail to enforce the law and hold criminals accountable, you get criminal behavior. So, Ms. Swearer, how does failure to prosecute past or current crime affect crime rates in the future?
Well, it certainly emboldens criminals and reasonably allows them to believe that there's a very little chance that they will be punished or in any way held accountable for their crimes.
Many of the proposals we're discussing today are widely implemented across the municipalities where crime spikes are happening. Would limiting law-abiding citizens' right to own a firearm curb these disturbing trends?
No, it would not, and I would also point out the reality of most gun violence is not that it's being perpetrated by people who lawfully purchase and possess their firearms. It is largely perpetrated by individuals with long histories of violence who obtain their firearms already through illegal and illegitimate channels that are not addressed by universal background checks because they are already circumventing the law regarding those background checks. It's a very low reward endeavor, even if it's like 100% enforceable.
Okay. What measures should be taken to ensure victims and their families are not legally ignored in favor of defendants?
I would, again, refer to some of my previous testimony, because I know our time is short. Previous testimony that I've given before the Senate Judiciary Committee on gun violence in Chicago, I think a lot of that is still applicable to your question. From a federal perspective, as I said, I continue to enforce federal laws and hold criminals accountable at a federal level when possible, and encourage state and local counterparts, some of whom have done a horrific job of this, to do the same.
So I just have a question. There's a called the NICS system, and when you purchase a firearm, as I don't know how many people in this room have ever gone through a background check, but it does ask questions. I know it was brought up earlier about criminals being able to purchase guns. Is it not already illegal for rapists and murderers and people who have done domestic violence and convicted of these things? Isn't it already illegal for them to purchase firearms?
To purchase and to possess, assuming they are felons and have not had their rights restored to them under existing state or federal processes, though there is no process under federal law, so it would just be under the state.
Okay, but the point is, it's already, we're not saying that criminals should have laws. We're saying criminals should be put in jail, and law-abiding citizens should be allowed to lawfully possess firearms.
That is certainly what I'm saying, and that is my understanding of what every member who has opposed H.R. 8 is saying as well.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Mfume, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. There's an old saying that your pain is where your passion is. And so let me just go back to where we started almost 3 hours ago at the beginning of this hearing and talk for a second about the pain that I felt, as I hope many of you did, listening firsthand to the accounts of witnesses and victims from Uvalde and from Buffalo. Listening to them, I am still stunned and heartbroken. The gun carnage that continues in schools, in supermarkets, in movie theaters, in churches, on the streets of my Baltimore and the streets of cities all over this country is a cross, ladies and gentlemen, that we all bear, whether we want to or not. The gun laws that we hope will be passed today, I hope, are seen as a beginning, not the end, only as a beginning. Otherwise, I really believe that we are doomed in our fight against murderers and their guns and the evil and the pain that they spread. I want to acknowledge and thank the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, the commissioner from Buffalo, and the mayor of New York, all of whom served in law enforcement and saw firsthand how difficult it is to deal with the violence perpetrated by guns, and particularly assault weapons. And I want to associate my remarks with those of Mayor Adams when he said, let the ATF do its job in rounding up so many illegal guns that are on our streets and to finally confirm a nominee. Madam Speaker, Madam Chair, you'll remember 1994. We were members of this body. We worked for a whole year to put together and pass an assault weapons ban. And the only reason it wasn't permanent was because we weren't able to get enough people, members, on the other side of the aisle, unfortunately, to go along with that. And so the compromise was a 10-year ban on assault weapons, which expired in 2004. I'm just shocked that 18 years has gone by and this body has not moved to reestablish that. In 1999, as a president of the NAACP, I filed suit against the gun industry. It took us 3 years to get to court because the NRA did everything they could to keep it from not happening. And finally, in 2003, we went to court. I testified in Brooklyn, New York for over a week, but we didn't have the weight we needed, and the NRA was a bigger force than we could deal with. And so we lost that, but the judge, to his credit, said this does not prohibit the fact that there certainly will be other lawsuits like this. The NRA heard those words and took them to heart and spent the next 18 months putting in place an absolute immunity on the gun industry, and unfortunately was able to get this Congress to pass it and sign into law. It is just unbelievable that we will get absolute immunity to any industry in this country, particularly when there's harm and personal injury. So I think more than anything else, I was stunned a little while ago in hearing the gentleman, my colleague on the other side of the aisle, saying that he had sought out advice from a military commander about how to protect schools and that the advice was harden the target. And Ms. Swear, when you were asked to comment on that, you said absolutely harden the target. Well, that's fine. Except, how do you harden a supermarket? How do you harden a church? How do you find a way to go out and harden movie theaters? If the only answer is hardening the target, we've already capitulated. And I'm telling you, I'm so glad that so many people are focused on this hearing around the country so they can see firsthand what is going on here. We have a problem that is not going to go away. Every year it gets worse. And so until we're prepared to do what we were sworn constitutionally to do, to protect this country from enemies, foreign and domestic, we would have failed. Madam Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins, is now recognized. Mr. Higgins.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Commissioner Gramaglia, looking at your presented statement, sir. say you support confiscating guns from individuals determined to be a threat to themselves or others. Determined to be. So by this legislation my colleagues are putting forth, my understanding of the letter of that law, which I 1,000% oppose, as would our founding fathers, the letter of that law says an anonymous tip from a citizen. So if this was law, Commissioner, would you confiscate, would you go to your neighbor's home and confiscate his legally owned weapons, a man that was not under criminal investigation nor under arrest? Would you do it?
The red flag laws would.
That's a yes or no, brother. I got 5 minutes to make an hour-and-a-half statement here.
It's more than a yes or no answer.
We'll move on then. If you cannot say yes, you would confiscate weapons from an American citizen that was subject to this law that my colleagues intend to push through this Congress, then you said in your statement that you would confiscate those weapons if an American was determined to be, your quote, a threat to themselves or others. According to that law, determined to be is defined by an anonymous tip that an American citizen is a threat to themselves or others. You're a police commissioner, a thin blue line brother, sworn to uphold the Constitution, and you're saying you'd seize those weapons. I see that as a problem. I'm going to bring us back in time to World War II. America's population, 140 million. 15 million American men came home from World War II with deep scars and significant skills. They bore the invisible wounds of war. And there was weapons everywhere. We'll talk about mental challenge. My father was one of those men who was a Navy pilot in World War II. He came back from the war and built his family. I'm the 7th of his 8 children. I was born in 1961. We had guns everywhere. There was virtually no regulation. Any child in the 50s could buy a weapon from any seller if Daddy sent them with the money. We didn't have mass shootings. It wasn't until 1968 in America that serial numbers were even required on weapons sold in this country. You order weapons through the Sears catalog by the mail. In the 70s, I attended a high school, large rural school. Virtually every vehicle in the parking lot was a pickup truck, and almost every one had a rifle or a shotgun on the back glass and a pistol under the seat. And we didn't have school shootings. 1979, I began college. One of the jobs I had to work my way through college was as a carpenter. We restored historical buildings. We had to determine in the process of that work what was the original cuts of these homes, residential homes built 75, 85, 100 years ago. You could tell by the saw cut if it was a mechanical cut, an electric cut, or a hand cut. By such observations, we knew exactly how that house was originally built. And to my amazement as a young man, beginning college in Louisiana, working, to my amazement, you know what I discovered, Madam Chair? You know what these houses did not have that were built 100 years ago in cities in America? You know what they did not have, Commissioner? Locks. Locks. Now, I ask you all, what happened to that country, man? A country where homes were built in cities with no locks. A country where guns were everywhere and virtually not regulated at all. Where millions of Americans, 14 million Americans came back. It's 11% of the population at the time after World War II with incredible skills of war and weapons of war, as you called them, everywhere. But we didn't have mass shootings. And here we sit today where an entire once proud Democratic Party is presenting unbelievably unconstitutional laws to press upon our nation, and we have a police commissioner that says he would go home to home and confiscate legally owned weapons. if he got a tip. Madam Chair, I yield my speech, but I will not yield my opposition to these unconstitutional laws.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentlelady from New York, Ms. Ocasio-Cortez, is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you to all of our witnesses here today. I apologize if I go quickly. We've just got 5 minutes and a lot of work to do. Let's talk facts here. There was a lot of discussion about New York City. There is no discussion about gun violence in New York City without discussing the iron pipeline that is Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, and honorary mention to Ohio, where 70% of likely illegal trafficked guns found in New York City come from. There's no discussion about gun violence in Chicago without talking about Indiana. Because the violence and the mothers that we have to comfort are losing children due to the guns and the carnage and the lawlessness unleashed by those states. I move on. Every week in recent memory, we have had at least one mass shooting. Ms. Pringle, you are the president of the National Education